Have you ever been disappointed with God? Have you ever felt like God wasn't there for you at some critical moment? I would wager that every one of us has experienced that at some time or other. I know I've shared this story before, but when Carolyn and I moved back to Canada from South Korea in the middle of the Great Recession and couldn't find work for months and months, it felt like God was failing us. Like I was just trying to be a faithful steward of what God would want me to do to provide for my family, and he was getting in the way of me doing that. And I couldn't understand it. I was angry with God. I imagine the Good Friday experience was one of those types of experiences where people feel like God has failed them. The disciples of Jesus were sure that he was going to finally bring God's kingdom, that he was going to finally end the humiliation that the people experienced, and then Jesus himself is subject to the humiliation. And he's crucified and killed. 2 days later, reports emerge that the tomb is empty, that angels have appeared. But it's all too much to hope for. It just feels like a cruel joke. We can see this because two of Jesus' disciples, rather than sticking around and trying to investigate, is this the truth, they flee the scene. They go for a walk to a town about 7 miles away from Jerusalem. And on the way, they talk to a stranger. A stranger that allows them to vent their frustrations. And a stranger who, it turns out, is the risen Christ himself. Let's read the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, found in Luke chapter 24, starting in verse 13. Now that same day, 2 of them were walking to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. And as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he would be the one to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's the 3rd day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. And some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus." So Jesus sneaks up on these guys and basically does the equivalent of, "Hey guys, why the long face?" And I think the important thing here is that he's inviting them to share their disappointment. Often when we feel disappointed with God, we feel it's our religious duty to pretend like we're not disappointed with God. Like somehow God would be offended with us if we were to ever say that we didn't find something that he'd done satisfactory. I guess if we think that way, we haven't spent much time reading the Psalms. But when we hide our discontent, especially when we try to hide it from ourselves, when we try to pretend that we're not hurting when we are, we're not showing our spiritual maturity. We're simply not being authentic with God, not inviting him into the place where we're suffering so that he can go to work in that place. Jesus wants these guys to understand how much they feel disappointed by what God has done. Because once they've gotten it out, once they've gotten it off their chest, then he can work with them. They dared to hope in God. But they feel let down by the humiliating death of Jesus. That Jesus died is terrible news. Jesus was the Messiah, they believed. So either they believed in a charlatan, never a good feeling, or Jesus is the Messiah and God's whole rescue plan for his people. The thing that's been sustaining their hopes for generations has all turned out to be nothing. A big failure. So they're deeply disappointed. They're also not just disappointed that Jesus died, they're probably also disappointed in how he died. When Judas Maccabeus, the great liberator who overthrew the Greeks who were ruling over the Israelites and trying to destroy Israelite religion and culture, when he died in a battle, outnumbered, he went out in a blaze of glory. They could look to him and say, God would be pleased with Judas because Judas stood up until the end. But Jesus just rolled over. When the representatives from the chief priests come to arrest Jesus, he could have called down fire from heaven, but he didn't. He could have encouraged his disciples to take their swords and fight, but he didn't. In fact, he rebuked Peter when Peter was the only one who showed some spunk. He went with them willingly, and they handed him over to be crucified, a method of execution that is meant to humiliate the person who endures it. It all just seems like too much. How could God be at work if he allowed something like that to happen to Jesus, his Messiah? They feel let down. I know that we all feel that way sometimes. Things happen that just don't seem like they're consistent with what you think God should be doing. And you want to ask those questions that never seem to get answered. Why me? How could you let this happen to me? Where are you in the midst of this? But here, we see that God is at work in the place of his apparent failure. At work even in this most terrible of situations. Now I think Jesus is probably chuckling to himself, saying, wait till these guys figure this out. And so he strives to give them a new perspective on what's happened to him by going back and looking at the Hebrew Scriptures. Picking up in verse 25, it says, he said to them, how foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the Scriptures concerning himself. So what Jesus is saying is, hey, if Jesus really were the Messiah, then the fact that he suffered is not a sign that God's plan has gone horribly awry. It was always the plan. It's a sign that God's plan is working. Because when we look at the Old Testament Scriptures, we can see it bearing witness to God suffering for his people and God's servant suffering for the sake of his people. And so he calls up a whole bunch of verses. I'm sure this must have been one of them, Isaiah 53, 3-5. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised. We held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. By his wounds we're healed. The setbacks and the disappointments are not God's failure. They are the marks of God's success. His greatest failure is, in reality, his greatest victory. The cross is awful. but it is not meaningless. God doesn't minimize the pain that you feel, but he wants you to know that it's not for nothing. He will redeem it. God doesn't will your pain. God doesn't sit up in heaven twirling his mustache and wondering what ways he can make you squirm because you're an imperfect person. Rather, God desires what is good for you. But his perfect desire for this world is frustrated by human free will that is not directed towards him. Sin has broken this world. It has real consequences. It causes real pain and suffering in people's lives. Sometimes the pain you feel is a consequence of your own sin. Sometimes the pain you feel is a consequence of someone else's sin. The point isn't to find who to blame for it. The point is that this is not how the world is supposed to be. That sin has broken it. But in spite of the fact that this world isn't as it should be, God's purposes will never be frustrated by human rebellion and sinfulness. God won't waste any of it. And so he can fold it all into his plan. Writing to the Christians in Rome who live in the shadow of a hostile imperial power, Paul encourages them this way. He says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purposes." Maybe you recoil when you hear this verse, because it's often one of the most abused verses in the Scripture. Maybe you say, I have experienced some stuff that really wasn't good. How can you sit there with a straight face and tell me that all things work for my good? Well, they don't. It's not saying all things work for your good. It's saying all things work for our good. There are times when I am the beneficiary of someone else's redemptive suffering, most notably of Jesus's. There are times when my suffering bears redemptive benefits to someone else. But the point is that through all of this, God's design to make the world right happens, and that God is able to use all of it to fold it into his plan without waste. So, if you hurt now, first, you can know that God hurts with you. In the story of Lazarus' death, Jesus goes to raise Lazarus from the dead. He's already told his disciples that he's going to do that. But when he encounters Mary and Martha, grieving the loss of their brothers, he weeps alongside of them. Even though he knows that this is all for God's glory and that he's going to transform it in like 30 seconds. He still cries with them because it pains him to see those he loves in pain. If you hurt, God doesn't minimize that pain, saying, I'm going to turn it all around and fix it. He enters into that pain with you. But as he enters the place of your pain, as it encounters the risen Lord, it encounters his resurrection life. And it opens up a world of new possibilities. I think sometimes that our pain and our disappointment is kind of like a woman in childbirth. The pain is real, but it is transformed by the subsequent blessing that comes out of it. Our pain can lead us to run away from God because we suppose that the pain happens because he willed it, because he's punishing us. He doesn't like us. Or maybe we just feel like he's unable to do anything about it, so why bother? But this is precisely the wrong response. We should invite him into our places of pain. That's what these disciples do. Picking up in verse 28. It says, as they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he was going further. But they urged him strongly, stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over. So he went to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? So here Jesus engages in a little bit of subterfuge, pretending like he's about to go on because really he's trying to arrange for an invitation to come with them. And these men oblige, and they invite him to come and stay with them. It's dangerous, after all, for a person to be wandering in the open countryside on the road after dark. And so he goes with them and he eats with them. Eating, of course, is a symbol of fellowship in this culture. And it says when they're at the table that he takes the bread, gives thanks, and breaks the bread. This language is the same language used to describe the Eucharist at the Last Supper. And Jesus has just given these disciples a primer on the true meaning of the Old Testament scriptures with regard to the Messiah, that he is the suffering servant. And now he's reenacted this symbolic meal that Jesus himself interpreted as a sign of his suffering. This is my body, which is broken for you. And I think the understanding that the Messiah is the one who suffers and the reenactment of the Eucharist together have suddenly opened their eyes. That and the Holy Spirit takes off the blindfold, and suddenly their pain is transformed. Their grief gives way to glory in an instant when it encounters the life of the risen Christ. And then he vanishes. In my understanding, or in my imagination, it's with a wink and a wry smile, because his work is done. They supposed themselves to be welcoming a stranger, but in fact, it was Jesus who was welcoming them. Jesus wants us to invite him into our places of pain and confusion and disappointment. He's not always going to take away that pain. But it's always a comfort to know the person who's present with us knows what it's like to be there. Carolyn and I had a really difficult time trying to have children. Finally, we resorted to a very expensive medical process. And much to our joy, we were expecting twins. But a few weeks after that initial joy came tragedy. We went to the midwife for our appointment, and she was only able to find one heartbeat. They sent us for an emergency ultrasound, and our worst fears were confirmed. We lost one of the pregnancies. While we still did have a healthy baby, Naomi, we had lost one. And I remember that I had to reach out and talk to somebody. And so I called a friend of mine who'd been through a similar situation. They didn't have twins, but he and his wife had been struggling to get pregnant, and they had gotten pregnant, and their first attempt had ended in a miscarriage. And so I called him and talked to him and poured out my heart to him. There was nothing he could do to change the situation, but it made me feel comforted to know that the person that I was talking to had been through it, that they had survived it. And I think that's kind of how Jesus is with us. Maybe you're thinking to yourself, Jesus hasn't been to the specific place I have. And that's true. Jesus doesn't know what it's like to lose a pregnancy. But at the same time, Jesus does know what it's like to feel like God has abandoned him. He repeats David's cry of dereliction on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? But his example reminds us that God is in the business of transforming grief into glory. Who could imagine such a transformation? That this humiliating defeat on Friday turns out to be God's great victory on Sunday. And this, of course, means that we can be reconciled to God. Hallelujah. But there's more to it than just that. Because the resurrection serves as a template. The first fruits in God's resurrection life coming into creation. Just as Jesus' suffering and his death is undone by God's resurrection power, so our suffering, our disappointment, our pain, our death will yield to the resurrection life of God at the return of Jesus. God is at work, redeeming our places of pain and our disappointment. Sometimes we see that in our life. I mentioned earlier that we had that period of time where we couldn't find work. But through that, God sustained us. And we always had enough money to pay the bills. And I think it's precisely through that situation that God showed me, in very practical, not theoretical terms, that he's faithful. And that freed me to be able to do some things in obedience to God that I don't think I'd have been able to do. Because I was able to trust that if I leave myself in this position of vulnerability, God's got my back. Sometimes we're not going to see it. Sometimes we will have to wait for the resurrection, but we know that day is coming. So today, if you feel disappointed with God, if you're feeling pain, and you're tempted to run from God, don't run away from him. Run towards him. God wants to be invited into your suffering. Will you trust him with it? He wants your grief so that he can transform it into glory.